Hello everyone, welcome to the History Valley YouTube channel with your host Jacob Berman. Today I am joined by Dr. Kipp Davis. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. And you?
Well, I'm doing just fine, thank you. Alright, so here's a brief introduction I've prepared. Dr. Kipp Davis graduated with a PhD from the University of Manchester in 2009. He has also written numerous articles on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he has also published some books titled The War Scroll, Violence, War, and Peace in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Related Literature, Essays in Honor of Martin G. Abegg on the occasion of his 65th birthday, and also the K4 Apocryphon of Jeremiah and the Qumran Germanic Traditions, Prophetic Persona, and the Construction of Community Identity.
That's such a mouthful. Actually, Brill, right before I published that book, Brill had changed their policy with regards to titles.
Oh.
And I wanted to call it something completely different. And as a result of their policy change, I also wanted to communicate more about what I was doing, and it ended up with that enormous mouthful that I often forget when I'm talking about it. So,
all right.
The big regret with the book.
Yeah, it did look like a somewhat long title.
Yeah.
But I think it's cool. All right, so now that's out of the way, let's begin. My first question that I want to ask is, how does the documentary hypothesis work in relations to the dating of the books of in the Old Testament?
Okay. Well, for starters, even before the introduction of the documentary hypothesis, it was recognized already in the Middle Ages that there were certainly at least elements within the Pentateuch that long postdated Moses. And for a long time, there was this idea that the texts were supplemented and were regularly updated. And I think among those who are opposed to the documentary hypothesis, who disagree with it, this is an element of what they would say to a number of especially quite conservative evangelical scholars will say that well, there's extensive updating within the Pentateuch, but there's certainly clues within several of the pieces of writing that they are quite late. Lots of scholars will tend to date the P source, which contains the Genesis 1 creation story that has quite a few literary and thematic parallels with the Enuma Elish. So they tend to date something like that to an exilic or a post-exilic period. And then there's also sections within Leviticus or within Deuteronomy which speak openly about a captivity as a result of their failure to meet the standards of the covenant in the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Leviticus is quite interesting because the exile there is presented as an atonement for the sin of the land, kind of like a sabbatical, a following of the land. So there's elements within the within the text that show, yeah, lots of this stuff is very late. Lots of this stuff comes from the exilic period. The book of Deuteronomy is something that is comfortably dated by, I think, most scholars to at least the reign of Josiah, if not, to core material being present in the reign of Hezekiah and then dramatically updated either directly prior to or at some time during the reign of Josiah. The book of the law that the high priest Hilkiah discovers in the temple, sure, based on the reading of it and Josiah's reaction to it, sure does sound a lot like the book of Deuteronomy. So, you've got P material that you can date to the exile or after the exile. You've got D material, the book of Deuteronomy, that you can date to just before the exile. J and E are a little more difficult, just because there's not nearly as many internal clues within there to suggest rather firmly, a clear dating for these things. For me, I tend to think it's Iron Age is about as specific as one can get. But those two, it's still, even the individual sources within the documentary hypothesis are composed of traditions and contain material that is very, very old. So, like lots of I've scholars like Kenneth Kitchen will point to lots of Egyptian loan words and lots of ideas or aspects of culture within the text that look like they come out of Egypt as a way to date it to the late Bronze Age, and to connect it to like an Israelite community of slaves that came out of Egypt in the Exodus. And there's nothing within the documentary hypothesis that negates the idea that there is material that came from much, much earlier periods. Texts within the Pentateuch, such as Exodus 14, is clearly a very, very old text, possibly coming from as early as the very early Iron Age, if not the late Bronze Age.
Wow.
So, or at least the tradition behind the text. Lots of this stuff was passed on. We tend to think orally for long periods of time before anybody ever thought to write it down. So dating's tricky, and internal clues will only take you so far, and not all of the texts are nearly as easy to judge on the basis of internal clues as others. I mean, something like the Book of Daniel is very, very, it's pretty clear and obvious when this was written, right?
Right.
Just on the basis of how he presents the history up until the reign of, up until the Antiochian crisis, and then almost knows nothing beyond that. So yeah, that's a different case. I was going to mention one other thing within the Book of Genesis. One of the things that I particularly like in terms of the dating question is the story of the Tower of Babel. Looks, and if any of you've seen, I think I talk about it in my second video, my second response video to Inspiring Philosophy. I talk about this. There's a very, very interesting artifact that came out of Babylon from the time of Nebuchadnezzar. I'm not sure the precise dating the artifact, but it's a commemoration of a renovation that Nebuchadnezzar had done on one of the ziggurats in Babylon, possibly the very old one that was supposedly built by Hammurabi himself. So when Nebuchadnezzar renovated this ziggurat, he erected this stone marker in which talks very glowingly about Nebuchadnezzar and how he's the greatest king on the entire earth, and how he gathered all these people together to build this temple, and they burned bricks and stuck them together with mortar, and they built this tower whose top reaches into the heavens. It sounds very, very, very familiar. It's very close in terms of the elements of the description to what we see in the story in Genesis chapter 11 concerning the Tower of Babel. And I think there's a good case to be made that the Genesis 11 story, even if it was based on a pre-existing idea of migration into the Valley of Shinar, I think the writer of that text probably saw what was going on in Babylon while in captivity in Babylon, and this is why much of the same language is reflected in the Genesis 11 story as compared to what we see in this marker. So, sorry, my dogs are.
Oh, it's all right.
Can you hear them?
Yeah.
Okay. So, sorry about that. My wife's a dog trainer, and she works from home. So it's not. Cool. I don't have the most ideal broadcast situation. So yeah,
that's fascinating.
Yeah, and there's lots of stuff within. There's lots of pockets within the Pentateuch itself, which indicate more precise aspects of a later Hebrew culture that postdated any sort of Exodus event, if that happened, or anything from the Mesopotamian period.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So essentially, based on how the text is dated, like at different pieces of Genesis, obviously not written by the same person, or Exodus, or whatever book is being discussed in the Old Testament, essentially you're saying that one can tell which author of that specific text, essentially when that author wrote that specific text. And you can tell that other writers of that same book that are redacting it added material later.
Yeah. Yeah. You can see places where there is it's a developing corpus over time. So one thing I want to I think is worth mentioning too is the idea of these as separate books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. I think that's depending on how far back you want to go. This is possibly not the best way to understand the construction of these texts. Most likely, because we have within the documentary hypothesis, certainly within all the documentary hypothesis models, you do have a running narrative, in particular with J and certainly with P, that starts from basically the time of creation. It runs through the patriarchs, through the Israelite dwelling in Egypt, through the Exodus into Sinai. So there is this narrative flow that you can see once the sources are separated in at least J and in P. So Genesis and Exodus, and especially Numbers, are later representations of this narration. And the reason why they've been separated into individual books, I think, has more to do with with scribal practices and with the limits and the conventions of constructing scrolls in antiquity. If these things were written on scrolls, one single scroll would have been too small to contain the whole thing. So they do have to split these things up. And you see this with other texts from the Hebrew Bible. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are representations of a division that was made for practical purposes, so that these things would not become too unwieldy.
That makes sense.
And this is something that we've learned quite a bit about in studying the Judean Desert Scrolls, in particular the Dead Sea Scrolls, and looking closely at the types of literature and how it's constructed. There's only a handful of excuse me. There's only a handful of the actual scrolls that contain multiple compositions. Some of these are scrolls that contain at least 2 books of the Pentateuch, but we certainly have nothing that contains all 5, or even as many as 3. And yeah, this because once you've managed to write the whole thing out, it becomes a massive unwieldy document. The Torah scrolls, which have been composed over the last numerous centuries by the rabbinic Jews, are massive things. I don't know if you've ever seen any of them, but they're huge. And the scribal tradition that is ongoing today is they've adopted practices and conventions which make it possible to get everything into a large document like that, even though it's still enormous. And it just we don't see anything like that in the scrolls from Palestine from the 1st century and before. So I thought that was that's something that's important to mention. So the book of Genesis is an idea that developed quite a bit later, in large part as a result of this bifurcation that took place.
So it was during these captivities, like the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, and so on and so forth, that the Jews seem to have assembled much of their mythologies during those time periods that would later be used as sources to construct their text.
I think you've probably got something that more closely resembles the Pentateuch we have today. Possibly as early as the captivity. Certainly not much later than that. By the time of Ezra, I think there is a Torah in place there that would look not all too dissimilar from the one that we have today. So, but and it's very difficult to say too, how far back or how many editorial steps back you can take, because you see the same thing. I mean, editorial activity is ongoing.
Hmm.
This is why we have multiple versions of the same text. I mean, there is a there's four big ones that we know of. There's the Masoretic text of the Pentateuch, of the whole Hebrew Bible, but just focusing on the Pentateuch, we have the Masoretic text tradition, which is the one that is translated into all of our English Bibles. There's the Septuagint text tradition, which gets its name from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, but we can now see that that they were certainly copying from Hebrew sources that look different than what was preserved in the Masoretic text. So that's two. You've got the Samaritan Pentateuch tradition, which is still used by the very small community of Samaritan Jews that that live in central northern Israel there. And with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have something that has been called the rewritten Pentateuch, which the editors Sidney White Crawford and Emmanuel Tove published these. There's five quite exquisite looking manuscripts that contain this so-called rewritten Pentateuch tradition, and they published it as under this title. But I believe they're both on record more recently as suggesting that no, this is better understood as a fourth Torah tradition. And then you have other crazy texts like the Temple Scroll, which is a form of the Book of Deuteronomy, but heavily supplemented and dramatically revised, but looks very close to Pentateuchal law. So the point here is that redaction is so this is redaction we can trace back to at least the 3rd century BC. How much farther back does it go? We're not sure. But what we do know and what we can reasonably posit is that it's something that was certainly taking place for as long as there were texts to write down and to be transmitted. So a friend of mine, actually, I loved what he in a conversation that we had just recently said this to me when we were talking about something similar. He said, we can actually learn a lot about manuscript transition and the fluid nature of writing by studying this particular case that he and I were talking about. And what we learn is not that manuscripts are reliable sources of history, but that all writings are susceptible to change over time. And this is this is amply demonstrated through the sources that we do have in our possession from antiquity, that writers and editors were not always even the identifying the difference between a writer and an editor becomes complicated in antiquity, just by virtue of the nature of transmission. This is, when people wrote down these sacred texts, based on the evidence that we have on hand, it seems like the strict conventions to precision of ensuring every letter and every stroke was maintained identically with what preceded it, as we see in the Masoretic tradition from the medieval period. That was not in operation as late as the 1st century CE. So scribes were scribes and writers, copyists, were writing out texts, but it looks like in various points along the way in this process, people also felt free to make changes, to provide useful updates, to make corrections as they understood them, which I think a lot of, like, when looking back on the question of the construction of the Pentateuch or the construction of biblical texts, I think a lot of this stuff you can chalk up as honest attempts at contemporizing and correcting. Take as a good example, the Genesis 1 creation story looks like an earnest attempt to take the most useful, up-to-date, contemporary knowledge that we have. I'm speaking, from the perspective of the writer. Most contemporary knowledge that we have about the origins of everything, and putting our local spin on it as a way to explain to our people where they came from and what we're doing here. So this is why I don't like the way the term plagiarism is thrown around with regards to lots of the biblical texts. It's a bit disingenuous to speak of them in that regard, because it sort of conveys a sense of duplicitousness or right, and that's just not what's taking place.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people use that term plagiarism, and there's even some really there are some really wild theories out there I even heard about, like in regards to so some people try to say that I've heard some crazy theories like the entire Old Testament came out of Egypt, or even some saying it came from India, and it's just,
my God,
yeah,
and this idea of where you've seen lots of, you see this quite a bit within the YouTube community. When speaking about the Bible, when speaking about the Hebrew Bible, throwing this idea around that these are just plagiarized texts that came out of other ancient Near Eastern cultures is just a woefully it's just a wrong way of thinking about this literature.
Agreed.
And the idea of intellectual property was non-existent in the ancient Near Eastern world. I mean, you start to get a much stronger sense of this by there's Greek writers who are clearly concerned with owning their own writing, but it's a slow to develop process, a slow to develop idea. I would argue that it's not something that anybody within within the Jewish literary communities that emerged from the exile, it's not something any of them are thinking about,
right?
Because so much of what they're doing is writing texts and attributing them falsely to other people. The book of Deuteronomy is probably the first truly it's probably the first pseudepigraph that survives in the Hebrew Bible, but it's not the last. You see that with the texts in the book of Daniel. These are texts attributed to Daniel that were not written by Daniel. You see this with how the Psalms are transmitted, and the Psalms are a really interesting case because it starts with somebody putting superscriptions on certain individual psalms and attributing those to David, on the basis of the long-standing tradition of David as a musician. And this corpus grows over time. It starts with with like I think it's 15 or 20 of the Psalms. It eventually grows to incorporate 70, and by the time of the first century CE, or the time of Jesus, you can use David as shorthand to essentially incorporate all 150 Psalms.
That's fascinating.
So another one, the Book of Lamentations, which is actually a really, really interesting text, because the Book of Lamentations is traditionally attributed to the prophet Jeremiah. In the Septuagint version, this isn't in the Hebrew text. It says in the Septuagint version that these are a collection of laments that Jeremiah uttered over the destruction of Jerusalem when it fell. Something that was added much later. But what's really, really intriguing, and what I think is an interesting question to raise with regards to this text, the Book of Lamentations, is that within ancient Israelite culture, laments were not performed by men. Laments were performed by women. So what you have in the Book of Lamentations is quite possibly the only texts that were written by women, and of course, attributed to a man. So, sorry, I carried us far afield from where we started.
Oh, that's all good. That's very fascinating. So, another thing I want to bring up is it has been heavily discussed by scholars that there's a very big difference between, at least in some places, with the Dead Sea Scroll version of Deuteronomy and the Masoretic Deuteronomy. One of the most fascinating thing that I've seen in regards to that is Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 to 9, when it talks about Elyon, the Most High, dividing the nations according to the number of the gods, not according to the number of children of Israel. But later on, it's been flipped from the Bene Elohim to the Bene Yisrael, so sons of Israel, instead of the number of the sons of God, or gods, because Elohim is thrown around singular and plural here and there, but Elohim is more typically plural, but El is the actual singular. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So I talk about this in also in the same video with the Nebuchadnezzar stele, and I think this is the scholarly consensus at this point, that the version that you're talking about, which appears in 4Q, I think it's 4Q. No, it's not N. Is it 4Q Deuteronomy Q?
That sounds familiar.
I would have to look it up. So, and I can actually, why don't I do this? Unless you've got something to show, I can probably pull up a picture here. Actually, no, I can't, because I don't remember which one it is. So I won't worry about that. So the scholarly consensus is that this fragment of Deuteronomy 32. Oh, actually, I could do this. Let me just plunk around on my computer for a second here.
All right.
No, not that one. That one. Yeah, I could do this. I'll try to talk while I do this. So this version, this copy of Deuteronomy preserves, and it's only a few words at the bottom of the fragment. I don't know if you've actually seen the fragment. It's just a handful of words preserved at the bottom. But Bene Elohim is preserved clearly there. And through the process of reconstruction, we can show rather definitively that that this preserves an older version of Deuteronomy, of this passage, that was clearly updated and changed by scribes who, I would say, were obviously uncomfortable with how closely this particular text straddles the divide between polytheism and monotheism.
Right.
So in the sorry, that's not. This is now. I'm going to have to go back here.
A similar text like that also exists in the Septuagint version of Deuteronomy, which talks
well, this
about...
is what we see is actually, and it's really neat because what you see is by comparing the three texts, is you can track the development, and you can see what the scribe is actually trying to do here. So the original version of this passage read, I'm just trying to find it here. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
So that's it. That is the fragment. And like, as you can see, there's like 3 words. So, but here we have in the bottom, very clearly, we have Bene Elohim. And what we have in this text, it reads, here, let me pull this up. It reads, when the Most High gave nations their homes. I'm using an old version of the JPS here. Okay. When the Most High gave nations their homes and set divisions of man, he fixed the boundaries of the people in relation to Bene Elohim, in relation to the sons of God. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his own allotment. So what you have being described in this text sure sounds like Elyon, the Most High God, dividing the individual territories up between the Bene Elohim, the sons of the gods. These are lower level deity, literally the children of Elyon. And what's being portrayed here, what's being depicted is the apportioning of their allotted territory. And you know, in Canaan, the individual tribes or groups of people throughout the region had their own local deity. And I think what scholars will tend to argue, most scholars will tend to say this is a description of what's happened, how this happened, and Yahweh, who sure looks like he's being depicted as a lower level deity,
right,
has been given Israel as his allotted portion.
Yep.
So this is, and you can understand why a scribe, why someone who's copying this text later is very uncomfortable with this reading. So what happens then? We also knew of the alternative version, which occurs in the Septuagint, which reads, when the Most High gave the nations their homes and set the divisions of man, he fixed the boundaries of the people in relation to Angelon Theo. This is in relation to the angels of God. So the reason for this is because the Septuagint translator is reading this text. He's got this reading in front of him, Bene Elohim. He's not, again, not comfortable with translating directly as into the Greek. So instead uses what's a developing idea during the Second Temple period. So this is like like in that 500-year period, basically from the exile up until the destruction of Herod's temple. In this period of time, there's a developing idea of angels more as God's messengers and warriors, at these lower level beings who are not to be equated with God, because there is also in this time a developing strong monotheism.
Right.
So the Bene Elohim become the angels of God. Another scribe who's working with the same text has the same problem, doesn't want to translate or doesn't want to copy Bene Elohim, and he's writing in Hebrew. So what he does is he changes Elohim to Israel and produces the reading that we have in our English translations, that which is preserved in the Masoretic text. He fixed the boundaries of the peoples in relation to Israel's numbers, in relation to the sons of Israel. So it's what you have with the discovery of this fragment, this manuscript, is kind of a link in the chain, right? We knew scholars knew based on what appeared in the Septuagint translation that a text like this was in the background there somewhere. But before the 1950s, when a scholar actually sat down and started reading through these thousands and thousands of fragments, we only guessed at the existence of this. But now, we actually have we have it there. That's in awesome. An ancient manuscript. And the really interesting thing about this manuscript too, is this is not a really, really early copy. Like this is a late Herodian script. So this is someone writing, literally in the in the first half of the first century, copying out this reading. So while Jews were by this time strict monotheists,
right,
some were not nearly as bothered by something like this as others, which I think is fascinating. That might be just as fascinating as the whole story of the transmission of this text in the first place.
Yep, it certainly is. And I tend to think that the division of nations is connected to what's being talked about in Genesis. Because there's a part, like in the beginning of the text, in the first creation story, the Most High is creating everything. But in the second creation story, Yahweh just shows up arbitrarily, and he creates Eden, puts Adam and Eve in there. And that's after the Most High went to bed on the Sabbath day. And,
so you read these things together, eh?
Yeah,
I guess, at one point, somebody certainly put them together.
Yeah.
I
think at least there's some sort of similar concept in the way that the authors of Genesis were thinking about things to the authors of Deuteronomy or authors of Deuteronomy.
Right. No, that's a good idea. I kind of like that.
Thanks.
So the idea here is that Yahweh has after the cosmic creation, Yahweh is the one who's actually forming the first of his people.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. I would say that that's very possibly in the mind. I still think these are independent stories, which were separate at one point in time, but I definitely could see a redactor putting them together with this sort of mindset in view, because this is something that those who put the Pentateuch together, these are the sorts of questions that they had to grapple with.
Right.
There's lots of conceptual differences within the text that they have to compensate for. And while I think we can look at the combined text and see places where, as a combined text, there's stuff that just doesn't make coherent or logical sense. You can see it very clearly in something like the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 37, 38. I think it's 38. I think it's Genesis 38. Where you've got the Midianites rescuing or taking Joseph out of the pit. Then you've got the Ishmaelites coming on the scene. And
are we talking about Joseph's dreams?
It's Genesis 38, which is the story of the part where he's
betrayed.
He's met up with his brothers in Dothan. They're very angry at him because of his dreams and because of the favor that's been bestowed on him by his father.
Right.
Which are two separate traditions, right? In one of the stories, this is a combined text of two separate stories about two separate ways of telling the Joseph story. So in one, he has all these dreams where he's the greatest, and the members of his family, including his parents, are bowing down to him, paying homage to him. That makes his brothers insanely jealous. It makes his father upset. Then you've got another story where his father, who in the other story is actually identified as Israel, not Jacob, dotes on Joseph, gives him this spectacular garment, this multicolored garment. His brothers are insanely jealous because of this. So different sources of their jealousy, but ultimately, they become insanely jealous of their brother. And then, when they have an occasion to kind of get him alone, they decide, we're done with this guy. And in one story, they resolve. In one story, in both stories, they decide we're going to kill him. But then in one story, Joseph's oldest brother, Reuben, decides secretly, no, I can't let this happen. I'm going to save him and return him to my father. So he says, well, let's just throw him in this pit here and leave him there. And let's get something to eat. So that's in one story. In another story, they decide we're gonna kill him. And then Judah says, no, let's just sell him to these Ishmaelites who happen to be passing by as a slave. So that's what they resolve to do. And then the Ishmaelites take him down to Egypt. So in the other story, Reuben has thrown him into this pit with the intention of rescuing him when he's got a minute. Meanwhile, these Midianite traders pass by. They find Joseph. They pull him out of the pit and take him down to Egypt and sell him as a slave there.
Right.
So the redactors combine these stories together, right?
Yeah.
And in the very, very carefully, as best as he can. And in the combined story, you've got now, Joseph's got these dreams, and his father dotes on him and has given him this coat. And it works together, and that part of the story works together quite well. It seems pretty seamless. It's got a very nice logical narrative flow. But by the time you get to the point where they've decided to kill him, he's thrown into the pit. Then they go to eat. Then it says these Midianites pull Joseph out of the pit. Then his brothers sell Joseph to Ishmaelites, who take him down to Egypt. And then at the end of the story, it says the Midianites sold Joseph to the Egyptians. So you've got this you've got this big mess here, right? Where you don't entirely know what's going on, whether it's the Midianites or the Ishmaelites who are buying Joseph and then reselling him to the Egyptians. So I bring that up only as a good example of a place where, for obvious reasons, the editor who's put these texts together doesn't resolve this conflict. It's too difficult, in large part because of what he thinks he's doing and how much of the older versions he wants to preserve, and also how much he wants to update. There's a tension always taking place there. But there's lots of parts throughout the Pentateuch where I think the redactor has done an amazing job, has rather brilliantly, carefully thought through what's going on in the narrative and how can I resolve some of these tensions.
Right.
I think there's pretty strong evidence that one of the sources consistently identified the patriarchs as Abram and Sarai. Another identified them as Abraham and Sarah. So when putting the stories together, the redactor turned, I think it's the Genesis 17 story of the covenant that Yahweh makes with Abraham. He turns that story into a covenant renewal ceremony, at which point Yahweh also changes Abram's name from Abram to Abraham. So that way, the redactor is able to sort of separate some of these doublets, and he puts all of those, where you see Abraham and Sarah, those then appear after Genesis chapter 17, and all the other ones where you have Abram and Sarai appear before Genesis 17. So he's working very hard to put these things together and to make some sort of coherent sense of it. And it's I mean, my hat's off to him. To be able to do this in this way took a ton of work and a ton of effort, and the product is actually pretty amazing.
Yep, it sure is. So basically, I think that pretty much explains it there. That's how, over time, it was streamlined from polytheism to monotheism, and no doubt it took centuries before the text actually fully became monotheistic.
Yeah, totally.
And even then, there were still some cults out there that kind of lean toward the polytheistic. Some ones. I
think possibly, or an element of polytheism, or I guess a monotheism by which you can still, essentially, I think the polytheism sort of turned into an apocalyptic worldview where all the other gods became forces of evil and darkness, right? So yeah, it sort of moved more away from this competitive, for lack of a better word, competitive environment, this sort of familial, territorial, tribal view of the Godhead, into something that was how do I put this? I keep thinking apocalyptic, but something in which God is there. There's one God, and He's on our side, but there's all these forces of darkness out there, these spiritual cosmic forces,
right,
that are against God, against the cosmos, against humanity, against us. So yeah, yeah. And it's in that sort of an environment that a text like Deuteronomy chapter 32 can continue to survive, looking like that. So yeah, it's amazing. And you still have these pockets within within the preserved Pentateuch. In Genesis chapter 1:26, there are plural pronouns used. God speaks using plural pronouns. Let us make man in our image. It occurs again in Genesis chapter 11,
right,
when God comes down to look and see what's happening at the Tower of Babel. You know, and there's various psalms which contain these polytheistic ideas. So it's yeah.
Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up right there.
And I think I'm going to say one more thing about this too. I think this is really, it's very, very difficult to read it's very difficult to read a monotheistic backdrop to a story like that of Josiah cleansing the temple, right?
Absolutely.
Because he is I mean, he's pushing hard for this Yahweh only program,
Right.
and in particular this Yahweh only program that's centered just in Jerusalem. What a lot of people miss in that text is the fact that he's not just eliminating the worship of other gods. He's also eliminating the worship of Yahweh outside of Jerusalem. You're not allowed to do it anymore. It's pretty crazy. But it's against this backdrop. You have to say, well, I mean, what has been going on? You look at the stuff he's taking out of the temple. There's images to Baal in the temple that he removes. There's images to the sun and the moon that he takes out. There's the temple of Jerusalem, and we don't know, the writer of what we call the Deuteronomistic history in Samuel and Kings is obviously deeply opposed to this, but it sure looks like the Jerusalem temple by the time of Josiah, and you can see elements of it throughout the text, is a place where not just Yahweh is worshipped, but they're worshiping all sorts of gods.
Yep.
So yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Or you've got a story like in I think it's I'm gonna get this wrong. There's a story in First Kings about I think it's either the king of Edom or the king of Moab. No, it's probably the king of Moab, who's fighting with Judah, and he's losing the fight. So he's super desperate, and he resolves to sacrifice his son to the god Chemosh in order to win the battle. And so he does this, and it seems to work because it says that, basically the way the text puts it, it says that, because of this, the tide of the battle was turned, and the Israelites retreated. How can you read that in any other way than to see that this human sacrifice essentially garnered enough favor with the local deity to sort of supercharge him in order to overcome the Judeans?
Right.
I find these sorts of things quite remarkable.
Yeah, same here.
So sorry, I feel like I talk too much.
Oh no, it was perfect. I think we got it. I think we got it. I think we got it down.
Cool.
Well, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, for sure. This was fun.
We gotta do this again. The next show we should be doing it on the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes, I'd like that.
Yeah.
And I want to say I haven't watched a lot on your channel, but I did watch a little bit of your Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls episode, which was quite good. Although I was and I pulled the one thing up here because I was looking at it after listening to your show. I think this is it. This is the that's the Hosea Pesher there.
Oh.
Which you talked about quite a bit. And at one point I remember you said that you think that there's much later redaction activity happening in the Hosea Pesher.
Yes.
And I'm not entirely sure about that. This is the manuscript here, and one of the problems with that idea is because of the date of the manuscript itself. Like this is it's first century, but it's definitely pre-70. So, but I just thought, I just thought I might mention that to you.
Sure.
But yeah, for sure. I mean, everything else was really good, but and this is a text that one of the problems with this manuscript, like a lot of them, was that this is one of the ones that was published in Discoveries of the Judean Desert, Volume 5. Are you familiar with the original publications?
I don't think I am.
Okay, so I'll tell you a story about this,
Okay.
and this is something we could talk more about in when we do another video. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were scheduled after their discovery in 47. They were scheduled to be published in this series called Discoveries in the Judean Desert by Clarendon Press in Oxford. They're great big. I don't have one on my bookshelf, but they're great big green volumes. They're super expensive, and the series is finished now. There's 40 volumes.
Wow.
They started in it, and it just finished. Like volume 40 was Eileen Schuler's publication of the Hodayot and the K4 Thanksgiving hymns, and that just came out in 2013, 14, something like that. So it just finished. So this is a series. The first volume was published in 1953. So it took over 50 years to get all this stuff published. Now, you can imagine, you can just kind of imagine what happens over 50 years. Not just in terms, not just in terms of what we come to learn and what we come to know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but even just in terms of methods in biblical studies and ancient Near Eastern studies, and the growing corpus of knowledge, right? So some of those earlier publications, they look really different, and the publication goals changed too. At some point along the way, originally it started off, you can see it in the first several volumes. The editors provide just a really brief description of the manuscript, its physical appearance, the color, the line spacing. They just mention, how they date the script. And then they provide like a transcription of what they see on the fragment and just a couple of notes about what's going on here. Very little commentary. It's just kind of like, manuscript, individual transcriptions, some notes about them.
Awesome.
Over time, and one of the reasons why it took so long, and one of the reasons why there ended up being so many volumes, is because more and more scholars starting, putting pieces together, developing a theology of Qumran, Yacha, the scenes that were living there at Qumran. And things started to become much more sophisticated. So over time, there's more and more and more commentary on lots of these fragments. So I was going to say this particular manuscript was part of a collection of, I think there were 40 or 50, maybe not quite that many. Maybe it was 30. I have to go back and look. 30 manuscripts that were assigned to John M. Allegro. Is that a name you're familiar with?
It does sound familiar.
So he's kind of like the black sheep in the he's the black sheep among the Dead Sea Scrolls scholars, because he was the one and only religiously unaffiliated scholar with the Dead Sea Scrolls in the original publication team. And then he started developing these really weird ideas in the 60s and the 70s about the origins of Christianity, and in psychotropic drugs, and something quite similar to the zeitgeist view of Christian origins, which is borrowing from all these pagan mythologies. So he started developing these really weird ideas, which just made things far worse for him with the scholarly team. But he was also he was working under he was working with this view in mind that he had to get this volume out quickly. So he looked at the fragments. He did his introductions to them, like these brief introductions about their physicality, the script style, line spacing, all that stuff. And then he writes out his transcriptions, provides translation for lots of them, and then a couple of notes. But the way he describes it in his letters that he was writing back and forth with people, his idea was that this was just kind of like a quick, rough sketch of what's he sees on the fragments. So lots of it's pretty sloppy, actually. He makes a lot of mistakes with regards to the transcriptions.
Wow.
And some of his ideas too. He sort of throws things out there, very hypothetically, without a lot of careful thought about it. So this whole volume, DJD 5, this is volume 5, is was very heavily criticized for, I guess, just how sloppy it was, right? And John Strugnall, who ended up being the editor-in-chief in the 1980s, at the time, shortly after this volume came out, I think it was a year or two later, he wrote a review called Notes. It's in French, but it translates as Notes in the Margins on DJD5, and he published it in Review to Qumran. The review is 170 pages.
Oh wow!
and it's just, it reads like just a list of corrections to all the mistakes that were made. So that I was just gonna say, this is a manuscript that even though it's been published for a long time, there's not been, as far as I know, there's not been a lot of scholarly work until more recently. There have been George Brooke, who is my Dr. Fodder, and Moshe Bernstein, who used to teach at Brandeis, I believe. Yeah, he taught at Brandeis. They were working on an updated, like a re-edition of this volume, because it was such a mess. But as far as I know, it's still not published. It's something that they have been working on for like well over 20 years now.
Wow.
But I don't think it's out yet. So it's, yeah.
Well, the idea
scholarship.
The idea that I was going through in that video was there may have been some redactions in the first century CE, and I gave my best.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
But I do take, other than that, I take the consensus view that the majority, almost all of the sectarian text, predate the first century CE, and I know that some try to force the teacher of righteousness, sort of Mora Hazadik, to be a first century CE figure. But the point of that video was, like, if we look at the Damascus document, which I'm sure you remember me saying this, that it seems to indicate the teacher of righteousness lived about 390 years after Nebuchadnezzar did his thing and died, and and he lived in. That would mean the teacher of righteousness established this community somewhere in the 170s BCE, and then in Second Maccabees, I noticed. Wait a minute. There was a final Zadokite high priest, the last one. He was kicked out of the high priesthood, and the way Second Maccabees describes him reminds me of the way the teacher was described in Psalms Pesher, and even in the last 3 columns of Habakkuk Pesher, the final verses of column 10 of Habakkuk Pesher, and especially 11, 12, and 13. They talked about an exiled priestly teacher, which resembled Yeshua or Jason, the last Zadokite, that was kicked out of the priesthood by Menelaus on 172 BCE.
Right.
So, rather, if they're the same person or not, which I think they might have been, that's up to others to decide. I think they probably are the same person. And if they are, then it kind of fits in the view that the teacher is 200 years before Jesus, and there's really no way to force him into the first century CE. And I know that there are people like Professor Eisenman, whom tries to say that the teacher is James. And my counter argument to that is there may have been redacting that may have made it appear that way in the first century CE, but we can't ignore what the Damascus document says. Obviously, originally, the teacher was earlier, regardless of redactions.
Yeah. No, I think we're on the right track with a lot of that. I don't know. The reason I would say I don't think the teacher of righteousness is Jason is because Jason was a pretty avid Hellenizer.
Oh yeah, I know there are problems. Yeah.
Yeah. So and I don't see that within the text. There's a lot of really, really cool textual development that you can read within the text themselves, though. Alison Schofield wrote a whole book about the versions of S, the Serach Yachad, and the textual development in there. I did a little bit in the Jeremiah Apocryphon book, and this actually relates a little bit to what you're talking about, because the manuscripts that contain the Jeremiah Apocryphon, 4Q385A, 4Q387, 4Q388A, and 4Q389, preserve a version of what appears in the Damascus document, this story. It uses the same 390-year time scheme. The way I read the text, it's actually heavily critical of the last of the Oniad priests, which would be Menelaus, Jason, and what's his name?
Onias?
Yeah, maybe. I have to go back and look at what I said, but it's heavily critical of them. It's hopeful. It's hopefully looking forward to. It looks like this is written right around the time of the emergence of Judas, because it sounds like it's hopefully looking forward to a Hasmonean priesthood. But I also think within this text, it views this text appears to me. This is just my idea. I don't know how strongly this is held by others. It's not really a text that many people have worked on, but I think this particular text is advocating for a temple-less Judaism. The way it talks about the temple, it talks about the temple as either destroyed or totally corrupt, and essentially irredeemable. What's really interesting, though, is there's another manuscript, 4Q390, which the editor, Devorah Dumont, had included with these Apocryphon of Jeremiah manuscripts. But it's not the same text. It is still very closely related, but it's obviously later. It's dealing, again, with the same time period, the same figures, but now it's like updated to the point where instead of hopeful expectation of the Hasmoneans, it's like anti-Hasmonean. It's pretty incredible how you could see like the same tradition just kind of growing over time, and them basically completely changing their minds about something and like turning it around on itself. And then it reformulates the 190 years in such a way that that shows that the Hasmoneans were terrible. So, but there's a bunch of stuff. In that in the other book you mentioned, the War Scroll book, the article that I wrote in there, it's actually one of my favorites, is about one of the so-called War Scroll documents, 4Q491, which my teacher, Marty Abeg, had thought was actually two separate documents, two separate manuscripts. And that's sort of the scholarly consensus that has carried the day. But when I've been looking at it more recently from a physical perspective, like when you're trying to reconstruct the fragments, it actually looks like you've got just one manuscript, but two different scribal hands, which is really, really cool, I think. And the other thing this does is it shows you early source material from like what we know as the War Scroll that obviously predates the War Scroll, but was used by the writer of the War Scroll and, again, reorganized totally. There's so much cool stuff in there. But anyways, I should probably run. It's been a little while. So this was fun.
Yeah, it was.
I hope you got what you wanted.
Oh yeah, I did.
Okay.
And some. And thank you for joining me.
Absolutely, anytime.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.